We were talking earlier on in the show about the by-election underway in Toronto, St. Paul's. Now, this is a part of the country that has a significant Jewish population, which is one of the reasons the Liberals have done some things that I think are more readily described as pandering to collect votes. Some cynics among us might even say that the Liberals' decision to finally classify the IRGC as a terrorist organization was involved in trying to whip up votes in the by-election, because they've previously declined to do this. And only now, in the middle of the by-election, did they all of a sudden say, well, on second thought, maybe the IRGC is a terrorist organization and we can call them that very clearly. Now, if you look at the polls, I don't think Jewish voters in Canada are all that convinced by this, because they've seen tremendous hostility towards them and towards certainly Israel for the last several decades, but certainly since October 7th. I wanted to talk about this. Some of the misinformation we've seen on the Israel file, a lot of it peddled in the legacy media, picked up unquestionably by politicians who accuse Israel of things like genocide and war crimes without providing any evidence. And one of the claims they use in support of that is that Israel is starving the people of Gaza, that there is a quote-unquote famine underway. Well, if you look at the facts on that, they simply do not support that conclusion. There was a great piece in the National Post written by Mike Fagelman of Honest Reporting Canada. His colleague, the Assistant Director of the organization, Robert Walker, is back with us now. Robert, good to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
So let's just talk about what the claims are, because this is something that's been quite pervasive, really going back to, I think, Israel's first moves against Gaza right after October 7th.
Well, that would be against Hamas specifically, of course, but that is exactly the allegation that that anti-Israel detractor is making, that Israel's been, carrying out this kind of indiscriminate, attacks and starving the Gazan population. It's complete nonsense. A lot of this really does come from doctored images and photos and video footage and so on. But a lot of it also comes from a report back in March from an agency which claimed that there was going to be imminent famine in Gaza. Now, this was not based on actual firsthand evidence. This was based on a lot of assumptions. Now, assumptions are, sometimes all you can work with. But what happened in this particular situation was that they really overpromised and underdelivered. In other words, they really made maximal claims based on minimal evidence. And then, of course, those who were paying attention more closely pointed out that there was actually no famine. There was more food aid coming into Gaza post-October 7th, about 1.5 times as much than was coming in pre-October 7th. So we're talking just about a vicious, scurrilous lie that was being peddled and then being uncritically regurgitated by a lot of the mainstream media, politicians, and so on and so forth throughout the world. But then what happened about 3 weeks ago, the same body came out with a report basically backtracking and said, there's no evidence of famine. And again, nobody paying attention would be surprised by that. There's no shortage of footage online you can find of bustling markets in Gaza. If Israel was trying to carry out the famine, it was the worst attempt possible. There's simply no evidence to suggest that. But not only is there a huge amount of food coming into Gaza, there's also, a tremendous amount of food being produced in Gaza, something along the lines of 2 million pita being created, every single day within Gaza. Something like 75% of the greenhouses in Gaza are still functioning. That's according to none other than the United Nations. So I think that those who have been claiming for months that there is some kind of a shortage of food in Gaza really ought to have egg on their faces.
Yeah, and when Israel, just to do the brief history on this, when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza close to 20 years ago, they left an incredibly vibrant and robust system there so that Gaza and Gazans could produce food, including many of those greenhouses you just mentioned. And, if they weren't using those, that's up to Hamas, which we know has, previously put its citizens in the line of fire, literally and figuratively, as propaganda tools. And so, my view on this early on was that if there is starvation taking place, it's because Hamas is blocking aid. But now it seems like there isn't even this starvation taking place en masse. The food is there.
In fact, there's not only sufficient food, there's far more than sufficient food. There was a recent report actually by a couple professors at Columbia University who really crunch the numbers, both in terms of how much food is coming in and what's being disseminated, how much is being grown, and so on. And they identify that there's actually more than enough food that's coming in. So there's definitely not a shortage. If there's any criticism at all, it's really on the perspective of how much is actually being distributed. Now, that's not up to Israel, of course, right? That's up to agencies connected to the United Nations, like none other than UNRWA, which you and I, as Canadian taxpayers, are helping to foot the bill of. This is, of course, organizations which help to foment ongoing terrorism, the disgraced United Nations agency. Right now, there are something along the lines of 4,000 pallets of aid sitting in Gaza that have been delivered into Gaza that await distribution, and that's because of the incompetence or the deliberate malfeasance on the part of UNRWA. It's not for me to say whether they're doing this intentionally as a public relations, war on Israel. This is just complete and utter incompetence, again, paid for by you and I as Canadian taxpayers. But either way, it's irrelevant. There is more than enough food coming in. And to the degree that there is any kind of a shortage, it is not on, how much food is actually being delivered, but what is actually being sent into Gaza. And again, the finger, as you said, has to be pointed not just at Hamas, right, the Islamic, jihadist terrorist organization running Gaza, but really the organizations that are being funded in part by Canadian taxpayers like UNRWA. So I think that we as Canadians should be outraged, to be very upset that our taxpayer funds are going to an organization that is helping to perpetuate not just any kind of humanitarian issue that may be present in Gaza. Again, I reiterate once again that there is no famine in Gaza, but to the degree that there is any kind of shortage in Gaza, but furthermore that this is the agency that really in no small part helps to perpetuate the misinformation and ultimately the conflict that is happening.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And one of the challenges here is that Hamas has always weaponized humanitarian aid and humanitarian channels for its aims. I mean, we recall very many years ago when these so-called flotillas were coming in of, people that were trying to, support Hamas basically under the guise of supporting the people of Gaza. And despite this, Israel has always ensured those humanitarian channels were there. And Israel has, a number of programs, not just to bring resources into Gaza, but to pull people out and get them healthcare and surgery. So none of this is new. But of course, in the era of propaganda against Israel, there's no credit for doing the right thing.
Not just that. I mean, listen, that Hamas actively bombs some of these humanitarian crossings. I was in Israel about 5 weeks ago, and in southern Israel, near the boundary with Gaza. And one of the days we heard these loud bangs. And it turns out later on that what had happened was actually Hamas had fired mortar shells, killing 4 Israeli soldiers, specifically at a crossing which had been sending humanitarian aid into Gaza. And as I said, 4 soldiers were killed as a result. So, Hamas does this because it works. When I say it works, it's because not only do they use their own people as cannon fodder, but they know that there is a very eager, enthusiastic even, body around the world, the quote-unquote humanitarian, so-called humanitarian organizations, useful idiots marching in the streets, politicians, and so on, who will take what Hamas is saying at face value and then essentially use that weaponized propaganda to their benefit. So Hamas does this not because they're idiots, quite the opposite, because they're very intelligent and they know very, very cleverly how to manipulate public opinion. And ultimately, I think it's up to us as Canadians to be able to push back aggressively on that, because that's the kind of disinformation that creates discord on our streets, that creates pressure for more Canadian taxpayer dollars to go funding groups like UNRWA, which help to perpetuate the war, and ultimately which help create conditions which only perpetuate suffering on all sides. So we as Canadians should be royally angry and very frustrated and upset as to how we as a collective society are being manipulated by Hamas. I mean, it's just absurd.
Robert Walker, Assistant Director of Honest Reporting Canada. Thanks for coming on, Robert. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Andrew.